Hello and welcome to the History of Russia podcast. My name is Damon, I live in the UK, and the aim of this fairly short introductory episode is to tell you all about the podcast, why I hope it's worth listening to, the general direction and scope, and when episodes will be released. I've always loved history, and for me the kind of history I love and when it works best is when it gets you into the minds of the people who were around at the time, so that you can experience how they lived, what their hopes and fears were, and what they did. Or, perhaps more importantly, what they didn't do or should have done. Because we have a nice and hopefully neat perspective when we look back, and obviously they were living in the here and now, a bit like ourselves at the moment. And why Russia? Well, I've been fascinated by Russia from a young age. I think it probably started when I was around 12 or 13. I'm at secondary school and it's time to pick a second language option. So all of us had to do French. And my choice was Latin. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, somebody said that there was a Russian course, a Russian language course that I could join. So I went for that. And the reason I went for Russian, and I didn't want to do Latin, the only other choice was German, but I wasn't considered to be clever enough to do German. And I became immediately intrigued with the different letters and sounds, and this stayed with me as I learnt more about the language, the people and the history, mainly from my own reading. And whilst my language skills have disappeared, which you'll probably pick up from when I pronounce some of the Russian words, although strangely I do remember the word for pencil, my fascination for all things Russian and particularly Russian history has remained. I mean, and after all, it's a vast country spread across 2 continents and 11 time zones, and it has such an amazing number of dramatic events and larger than life characters to explore within its history. And our cast list of these characters as we meander across the centuries, exploring the Russian state from its early beginnings, conquest, expansion, time of troubles, the age of empire, revolution, Soviet rise and collapse, and the Russia of today, will feature Vladimir the Great, who introduced Christianity to Russia. 3 notable Ivans, Moneybags, I just love that name, Ivan the Great and Ivan the Terrible. A couple, at least, of fake or false Dimitris, Peter the Great Western-looking Tsar of Russia, the tragic life of Ivan VI, and then Elizabeth and Catherine the Great, Nicholas and Alexandra, Lenin, Stalin, Gorbachev and Putin, and myriads of others, plus of course the millions of ordinary people, all acting out their parts through Russian history's shifting patterns, set against a background of corruption, ineptitude, serfdom, religious persecution and cruelty in a country that seems so unfeasibly massive, foreboding, distant, and yet so utterly unique and compelling. And we can add to all of this a bit of a dilemma. What's Russia's current standing and reputation in the world? Is it good, bad, misunderstood, or all three? And are there any underlying historical reasons for this? Well, as we'll probably find out, or I hope we'll find out during the podcast, there almost certainly are. Because on the one hand, I think here in the West, we're a bit wary and maybe fearful of Russia. After all, it has been a bit of a bogeyman, and it can appear to be a hard, dark place. Plus, our contemporary consciousness has been shaped by recent historical events such as the Cold War, the Gulags, Chernobyl, Novichok, violent football fans and hacking. And yes, I do know that Chernobyl was in the Ukraine, but at the time the Ukraine was in the Soviet Union with the rest of the Russian states. And I'm going to quote from, well, it's not really a quote, but it's something I saw just recently on television from probably one of the greatest programs I've ever watched, which is Le Bureau, which in its later series does take place in Moscow. And a couple of the characters are talking, and they're talking about one of the spies who recently has been, and I'm sorry this is a bit of a spoiler, He's recently been held captive by ISIS, and now he's gone across to Moscow and he's being held captive by the FSB. And somebody says, do you think he'll survive his treatment at the hands of the FSB? He survived his treatment under ISIS. And one of the other characters says, to be perfectly honest, I'd rather be held captive by ISIS than I would by the FSB. Just thought that's an interesting anecdote. But at the same time, we also have a kind of grudging admiration for the country, its people and its culture. After all, what would Europe look like now if it wasn't for the sheer guts, determination and back-to-the-wall heroics shown by our then Soviet allies during World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, as it's known in Russia? At a more basic, sort of current level, would you go out and protest on the streets against the establishment in Yakutsk, where it was minus 45 a couple of weeks ago? I'm not sure I would. And I'm interested in what other people over the years have had to say about Russia, and they're far more important and knowledgeable people than me. And I've just picked out a few quotes, not too many, just to share with you. Some of the ones I found interesting. And the first one is from Fyodor Tyutchev, who is a Russian poet and lived between 1803 and 1873. You will not grasp her with your mind or cover her with a common label, for Russia is one of a kind. Believe in her if you are able. And then we have a quote from Otto von Bismarck, the great German Chancellor of the 19th century. The secret of politics, make a good treaty with Russia. Now, I love that. In other words, I think what this means is watch your back. This one from Winston Churchill, so well known. I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But perhaps there is a key, and that key is Russian national interest. And this one I really liked, from Count Munich, who I think was around the time of certainly the Empress Elizabeth, maybe even Catherine the Great. The Russian state has the advantage over all others in that it is controlled directly by God. Otherwise, it is impossible to understand how it exists. Yeah, it sort of speaks for itself, really, doesn't it? And then finally, and we couldn't leave Vladimir Putin out of this, Russian democracy is the power of the Russian people with their own traditions of national self-government and not the realization of standards, and these are my capitals, foisted on us from outside. Yeah, interesting. I've subtitled the podcast Events, Culture and People, and that's exactly what I'm going to cover. So the first couple of episodes, they're kind of set-up episodes. Episode 1 will consist of a geographical overview, pointing out the major features, which will hopefully serve a twofold purpose. So as a useful background to future episodes, but more importantly, the impact of Russia's geography upon its history and how both have shaped the way politically that the country is today. And then we'll have episode 2, which will start approximately 2 million years ago, and we'll look at the prehistory and antiquity of the vast area that is currently made up of Russia and will take us to the 9th century, there or thereabouts, of the Common Era. And the reason I'm covering so much sort of basic history in the one episode is I really want to get to a period where we're talking about people rather than bones and scraps of remains that have been left. Then once I've set the scene, in subsequent episodes I'll get going on a more detailed chronological narrative history, taking us from the first proto-Russian state in the late 800s to the present day. And then once all of that has been completed, and I know it's going to take a long time, at this stage I'm not sure how long, I'll start to look at particular events in more detail. And one of the ones that I really want to do is the Siege of Leningrad in World War II. For some unknown reason, I'm really fascinated in that. So those episodes will come after the chronological narrative, and they'll be about key individuals and particular elements of Russian culture. That's my plan anyway. And finally, and this is really important to me, and I hope it is to you as well, whilst I want the podcast to be factual, informative, concise and comprehensive, I also want it to be a bit of fun. I'm going to aim to do episodes every couple of weeks, but I might slip in the odd episode on a weekly basis. I'll see how I go. The podcast website is thehistoryofrussia.podbean.com, and this is where episodes are hosted and where I also post any visual aids such as maps, stats, timelines, etc. Oh, I love that term, etc. It means I really couldn't be bothered to think of anything else, but there are some other things. All of those things for any of the episodes that need them. Okay, that's it. Introduction over. I'll be back next time with the first episode proper, and I really hope that you'll enjoy the podcast. So, until then, stay safe, keep your head down, and I'll see you soon.